Good afternoon. Welcome to our class about Mezcal here at Reforma, Modern Mexican Mezcal and Tequila. My name is Grant Kruger. I'm the owner here at Reforma, and we thought we'd like to offer you guys today, out there in Facebook world, a view and a little course about mezcals. Last week we had the opportunity to talk to you about tequilas, tequila products, the distillation, the origins and history of tequila. And today, I thought I'd give you the opportunity to talk about my favorite category of distilled agave spirits, the most misunderstood of distilled agave spirits, mezcal. Now, many of you have heard the name mezcal, but probably most people don't know the differences between mezcal and tequila. And we thought we'd give you the opportunity today to learn about some of those characteristical differences and talk about some of the history of mezcal, the culture behind it, its significance to Mexico, and the importance of mezcal today. And so I thought we would start with some of the basic differences. I get asked a lot here at Reforma, what are the differences between tequila and mezcal? When you taste mezcal, what do you taste? And rather than get into just the nuances and flavor characteristics, I like to think that I taste three categories in mezcal, and that's time, patience, and history. Interesting answers for sure, because you say, Grant, that's crazy. How do you taste time or patience or history in a glass? Right? It's like I thought you would say something about smokiness or something about herbaceousness or minerality. But truly, time and patience and history make up the essence of mezcal. This is truly an artisanal product that takes between 8 and 30 years to produce. And I'm going to go through some of that production process with you today so you can better understand both the time, the patience, the history, the toil and sweat and back-breaking labor that it takes to produce a bottle of mezcal and put this in the glass for you over here. Because it's not a short or easy process, and it's not a short tale. So join me today. Thank you for coming out. I'd like to get started with you. First and foremost, there's a concept of terroir. And we talked a bit about terroir last week. And that's going to talk about the sense of place, about where a spirit comes from, right? Because everything matters in artisanal production, particularly with respect to mezcal. The wind, the rain, the slopes of the hills, the sunniness, the soil, the hot or cold temperature, the humidity, the elevation, all of it counts in mezcal production. And so we're going to talk about some of those basic characteristics and why there's such a variation of flavors in mezcal as opposed to tequila, and what makes mezcal really awesome. Now, one of my favorite sayings about mezcal is in Spanish, and I'll translate it over to you over here today. And that is, para todo mal, mezcal. Y para lo bien, también. And what that translates to is, for all the bad things, mezcal, and for the good things as well, too. But there's another line to that one as well that I find particularly amusing, and you see that one less often. And that one is, si no hay remedio, un litro y medio. And what that means is, if there's no remedy, 1.5 liters. And so what this is suggesting is that, kind of like that saying in the United States where they say to alcohol, the solution and cause of all of life's problems, we've got a similar saying for mezcal. And it plays a very integral part in Mexican culture and lore. Mezcal happens to be one of the oldest spirits produced in the world, and certainly the oldest spirit produced in North America. Its history goes back somewhere between 400 and 500 years ago, right? The first concept of distillation of spirits came in about the year 800 from an Egyptian scientist. And the concept of distillation makes its way into North American culture via the Spaniards in the 1500s. And so the Spaniards took the concept of a alcoholic agave beverage, which was called pulque. Now, pulque was commonly found throughout Mexico and is a fermented agave beverage from the sap of agave. It's essentially an agave beer. And we mentioned pulque a bit in our tequila class, but pulque has been around for well over 1,000 years in some capacity, because it naturally formed from scooping the sap from the agave and the wild yeast that were found in the environment. When left out to openly ferment, they would make this fermented agave beer. And it probably had an alcohol by volume percentage of, let's say, 4 to 8%. Now, this was banned over the years by various Aztec kings and rulers, and often only left for the elitist ruling class, so that the general populace wouldn't be poisoned by this particular pulque. And there was a lot of legends about its origins and its creation. We talked briefly last week about Mayahuel, like the Aztec goddess of both the agave and fertility. Now, that's a pretty cool combination over there when you think of agave spirits and fertility. And there's probably no, it's not unbelievable to think that those two things were terribly related. Mayahuel happened to have herself a little romantic spill with another Aztec god named Petacatl. And the creation of their union was over 400 children, according to legend. And these children were the rabbits. And they were the Senson Totichin. And these rabbits were the gods of drunkenness. Now, there were over 400 of them, and Mayahuel had over 400 breasts to suckle each one of them with pulque at the time. Not mezcal. We'll get into the mezcal here briefly. But the legend was that the spirits of these 400 rabbits would get into the souls of those who drank the pulque, and their drunken behavior would be explained by which of the rabbits happened to possess their bodies at this particular time. The concept of 400 didn't really mean exactly 400. In the Aztec series of counting, 400 was close to infinity at that time. And so the idea was that there were just many different drunken spirits out there that could possess your body. And these were the children of Mayahuel. Now, in the 1500s, the Spaniards brought over this process of distillation and alembic stills into the New World. The first mentions of agave spirits come from, in literature at least, in 1621. Domingo Lázaro Araquí wrote a message to his Spanish king about this new spirit that was clearer than water, and that it was distilled in Nueva Galicia, which was at the time Mexico. And so we're talking about nearly 400 years ago, like written messages about mezcal. So this is really, really an ancient spirit that's been produced since nearly the beginning of written time here, quite frankly. Now, in approximately 1595, Don Pedro Sanchez de Tagle applied for the first official agave distillery in the town of Tequila. He's known as the father of tequila. But Don Pedro really would have been the father of mezcal. In fact, the term tequila didn't even come into place until another 200 years, almost 300 years, quite frankly. But nonetheless, Don Pedro was the first individual almost 400 years ago to apply for official tequila distillery and fields. And he had those somewhere around the outside of modern Guadalajara, in the town called Tequila. And so fast forward to about 200 years, and you get Jose Maria Guadalupe del Cuervo. And yes, that Cuervo family, from the Cuervo Tequila family in 1795, had the first official permit from the Spanish government to produce vino mezcal de tequila. That family has been producing tequila for over 200 years now, and have a strong history of producing distilled agave products, all of which was still called mezcal. We didn't even get into the concept of tequila or the name tequila for another 100 years. Now, moving forward, the first mention of tequila spirits, even the word tequila for distilled agave spirits, occurs in 1873 in Spanish tax records, when they began to tax the production of tequila. And so even then, up until that point, we were still pretty much calling the product mezcal. But the town of Tequila began to try to find ways to elevate their product and to standardize their product and to get some mention of this. But at that point, we were still talking, for the most part, about mezcal. And so tequila at that point began to take off on its own. And throughout the 1900s, traditional mezcal production, and we'll get into the description of what that production is, really started to taper off in popularity, and tequila started to boom. This didn't mean mezcal wasn't produced anymore. It was always been produced in the areas around Oaxaca, but it certainly lacked the regulatory oversight that tequila did, and often the quality that tequila had as well too. Mezcal had, by virtue of being unregulated, had some real peaks and valleys in its quality over the years, and that affected its marketability and affected its reputation as well. And so only in the year of 1995 did mezcal finally receive its world denomination of origin. And what that means is that it gave it a sense of place, that they actually finally listed, these are the exact regions and the exact standards that you will use to produce mezcal if you wish to call it mezcal in the bottle. That's not that long ago, 1995. And we're talking about a product that's been produced for hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries. And it took us that long to reach this standardization of processes. And although the denomination of origin was created in 1995, and the Norma Oficial Mexicano, the NOM, that we talked about, that were located on the bottles of tequila and on the bottles of mezcal as well too. In quality mezcal, you'll see the NOM for the distillery number on the back. This process started with NOM number 070 SCFI 1994 in 1994, and really only began to become regulated in the year 2005 by the creation of the Comarcam. The Comarcam was the overseeing body that actually regulated the production of mezcal. In 2005, the first NOM for mezcal was issued to Eric Hernandez from Illegal Mezcal. He was NOM number 1, even though this individual was a third-generation mezcalero who had been producing mezcal for 100 years in his family. He got NOM number 1 in Mexico in 2005. And so it's taken a long time for us to be able to classify and quantify mezcal, to talk about the production processes behind it and the rules associated with mezcal. So much like tequila, mezcal is a distilled agave product, right? Unlike tequila, which can only be made from one species of agave, mezcal can be made from upwards of 50 different species of agave. The truth is, nobody knows, even to this day, exactly how many species of agave are used in mezcal production. How is that even possible in 2020 today, that we can't even quantify the exact number of agave that are used for mezcal? Well, the Comarcam in its time designated 5 different types of agave, but the truth is there's a lot of subspecies and a lot of hybrids and cross-pollination between these various wild agaves in the hills of Oaxaca. And as such, there isn't exactly an exact science to how many we have. But in my research, I found that there's somewhere of about approximately 50 different species of agaves. If you care to ever geek out about it, there happens to be a book written in 1982 by Howard Scott Gentry. Dr. Gentry was a professor here at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and he wrote a book called The Agaves of Continental North America in 1982. Now, I'm sure you guys all have your copy of that book and have been referencing that one as well too, but it actually is, all jokes aside, a pretty interesting topic, and it happened to have really been expounded upon by a professor here in Tucson, Arizona. How neat. At Reforma here, we happen to have an agave spirit cocktail called the Maestro Gentry, named after Howard Scott Gentry, to celebrate him and his research on wild agaves and bringing knowledge of this product up to the forefront. So getting back to these wild agaves, right? There's over 50 species that could make up mezcal. The most common species is going to be the agave espadín. We talked briefly about the agave espadín last week. It happens to be one of the largest agaves out there. Espadín essentially takes 10 years to grow, and it's one of the only agaves out there that's created in a professional agricultural manner. Almost all the rest of the species we're going to talk about today are created or formed as wild agaves silvestres, that are found on hillsides and mountaintops and on the sloping volcanic hills of the regions around Oaxaca. But it's not just Oaxaca where they can grow agaves to create mezcal. In fact, there are currently 8 different states where mezcal can be made. It happens to be Oaxaca, Durango, Guanajuato, Guerrero, San Luis Potosí, Tamaulipas, Zacatecas, and Michoacán. All of those states can grow agave for mezcal. Now, there are 5 states that can grow agave for tequila, and that's Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, Nayarit, and Tamaulipas. If you're keeping score at home, you'll find that in Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Tamaulipas, there's an overlap. You can actually grow a Weber Blue Agave Mezcal in those 3 states that, by virtue of being in the same states that overlap with tequila manufacturing, this product can count as both a mezcal or a tequila simultaneously. Because mezcal is essentially the overlying category for distilled agave spirits, and tequila is one of its subsects. Tequila is nothing more than a specific recipe for mezcal grown in this particular region using only the Weber Blue Agave. There are other distilled agave spirits beyond just mezcal. We talked briefly about Bacanora and Sotol last week, and there's also Raicilla, which is commonly found in the state of Jalisco, but outside of the growing regions in the towns of Tequila and its neighboring little villages. And so there's a number of places where they grow distilled agave beverages. In fact, I found 18 different states distilling agave beverages in Mexico right now, and yet only 8 count for mezcal production. Why? Politics, money, bribery, influence, all of it. But for the moment, we're talking about 8 different states that the Comarcam, which is now called the Consejo Regulador de Mezcal, the CRM, regulates and allows to be called mezcal. Now, this product grows in these farms outside of the regions of Oaxaca and the 8 other states we talked about. And these are truly, truly small batch artisanal spirits. Unlike the tequila, which is now produced on giant agro-business farms, cooked in giant steam autoclaves, the mezcal is made in a much more rustic and artisanal manner. And that's what makes it so cool. That's what makes the mezcal really unique, is that you're going to find variation from village to village. You're even going to find variation from batch to batch. Have a really amazing bottle or batch of mezcal? Enjoy it while you've got it now, because quite frankly, it might not be the same the next time you have it. There's that much variation in this small batch mezcal. Why so much variation, you ask? Well, let's talk about the production process before we get into a few of the examples of mezcal that we have here. Right? These agaves grow for anywhere between about 8 and 30 years. Think about that for just a brief moment. Most of the plants that you grow, that you make spirits with, are annual production. And so every year you get the opportunity to grow grapes. Every year you get the opportunity to grow wheat. Every year you can grow corn. If you screw up your batch of agaves, of something that might take up to 30 years to mature, like a tepestate, guess what? Wait another 3 decades until you grow it again, right? Like, that's the amount of patience and time it takes the mezcalero. They might plant these agaves when their children are 1 year old and not harvest them until their children are adults with their own children. And so over that course of up to 30 years, these agaves every single season have an opportunity to take in some of the local flavor, that terroir we talked about, the differences between the wind and the rain and the soil and the slope and the sun. And it's not just those things. It also affects where the plants are being grown. What other fields are out there? Are there cornfields out there like there are for the Vago elote that we've got over here? Or perhaps there's milk production, like heavy dairy cow production that exists by the agave fields in Michoacan, where some of the mezcals actually are noted to have cheese-like characteristics and taste to them as well too. This is terroir, guys. This is that what makes mezcal so cool is that it truly picks up the characteristics from the land, not over a 1-year period, but over an 8 to 30-year period. And so you've got these agaves in the field, right? And these mountains, often far away from where the palenque is. The palenque is going to be your word for these rustic farms. These are not giant agro-business places. These are like literally rustic farms. And we're going to talk about some of the low-tech methods that they use in the production of mezcal and how that differs from tequila. So they go out into the mountains and find these agaves and test whether they're ripe or not. The first thing they want to do is pick an exact period of when you're going to harvest that agave. Now, part of it is figuring out of that agave, when it reaches its cycle of maturation, that giant stalk comes out of it. You've seen them in the century plant here in Tucson, right? The quiote, and it sticks out the top. That is the reproductive organ of the agave. If you wait just a little, let me back up. If you cut that agave down too early, before the quiote comes out or starts to come out, you're going to get a mezcal that's bitter. And if you wait too late, even a couple weeks after that quiote comes out of the top, it's now soaked up lots of the starches and energies of the plant in its opportunity to try to reproduce, that you're going to get bad mezcal as well too. And so the timing of this needs to be perfect. And it's a dance between knowledge passed down from generation to generation, from farmer to farmer, of an understanding of exactly both the species of agave, its maturation, and when you're going to strike off that quiote, and when you're going to harvest this particular plant. But either way, you end up taking the spines off of that particular agave. We hack them off with a koa, and that's the process of the jimador, right? That takes all these off, and you get this heart, this piña. Now in mezcal production, some of the larger mezcals, the Espadín or the Oaxaqueño, have very large piñas. They could be over 100 kilos, 200 pounds, that could produce 15 or 20 liters or more of mezcal out of just one piña. And then there are others that are teeny tiny little plants like the tobala, where you're lucky to get 1 liter per plant. And so this varies a lot and changes the baseline flavor characteristics of the mezcal. The analogy we use is that how wines are to grapes, agaves are to mezcal. And so not only do the various different species of agave affect the flavor, but the local towns and their production styles affect that. So let's talk about those production styles, right? You've got this agave piña that you've pulled out of the earth. And now you've got to hack it up into pieces, and the size of those pieces matter. And then you're going to cook it. Again, in tequila production, they've moved on from the small batch rustic cooking styles and instead use big steam autoclaves. In mezcal world, they dig pits and they make a fire inside of this conical pit. Now they've got to get wood from somewhere, right? And that becomes a problem as these volcanic hills have less and less wood every year as you're stoking the fire for production. It's one of the reasons that tequila eventually moved away from wood to cook their agaves. With the rapid deforestation of the areas around Tequila, Jalisco, they quite frankly ran out of trees. And so the smaller batches of mezcal have yet to experience exactly that same problem, but it's coming. As mezcal's popularity grows, it's going to be tougher and tougher to produce this product in an environmentally sane way and to have wood to continue to make these fires. But they make this fire, and then they cut the piñas up into bits and pieces, large chunks, about the size of your head, more or less. And they place them, in some cases, on top of stones that are sitting on top of the fire. In some cases, they even separate them from the stones with the fibrous pulp, the remains of the liquid and pulp when you crush the agaves out, the bagazo, if you remember from last week. And so many of the agaves sit directly on the fire. Some sit on top of the stone on top of the fire. Some sit on top of the stone on top of bagasso on top of the fire. All of that is going to affect the flavor characteristics of the agave. That smoky flavor that mezcal is known for comes from the smoke rising up, that char of the plant as it cooks in this conical pit. They cover that pit up with bagasso and often these canvas type tarps, and they let it smolter for anywhere from 3 days to over a week. And those piñas begin to transform from starches on the inside into the sugars. And out comes that miel de agave, right? That sweet syrup that still doesn't have any alcohol in it, but has now been driven out of the piña. Now, we've got to figure out a way to take these piñas and get that miel de agave out of them. But there's another step before you even get that far that affects the flavor characteristic. And that's how long you let the piña sit. In many cases, the mezcalero may choose to let those piñas sit and mature for 2, 3, 4 days before they crush the miel de agave out of it. Now, I know what you're thinking, 3 or 4 days sitting out rotting. If I left a piece of pizza sitting on my counter for that long, it would go off rotten and be terrible. But the truth is, this just adds some flavor to the product, and you're going to distill it a couple times. And so anything dangerous about its rotting is going to be washed away in the distillation process. But all of it affects the flavor of mezcal. How long that agave rests before you crush the juices out of it. Now, we had talked about giant machine shredders that they use for tequila to shred these piñas to pieces to get the juice out. And we even talked about the Tahona and how the giant Flintstone-style stone wheel driven by a donkey that drives over these piñas and crushes the juice out is a technique, the old school technique to get tequila out. But turns out that's actually pretty modern technology when it comes to mezcal production. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, how can a donkey driving a stone wheel be modern technology? Well, the truth is, a lot of the small batch mezcal production, some of these palenques can't even afford donkeys or giant stone wheels. This stuff costs money. And the actual process for crushing the miel de agave out of these piñas, these roasted pieces, is to put it between 2 boards of wood and beat the hell out of it with a sledgehammer, quite frankly. So you can see where the donkey and Tahona is actually a significant improvement in mezcal, where it happens to be the old school production way in tequila. And so now you get this juice out of there, right? This tapache is what they call it. And it still doesn't have any alcohol in it. And that's where the open pit fermentation comes into play. And it's the neatest part about the mezcal production, because this is where that local flavor seeps in. We talked about the dairy cows in Michoacan. Perhaps there's cornfields or some nut trees or fruit trees like nearby. All those pollens, all those yeast and flavors come into that open pit fermentation and add to the already complex myriad of events that have changed that mezcal's flavor. Open pit fermentation truly is the reason for the terroir, where it picks up all of those local characteristics, which makes the mezcal different from not just batch to batch, but from village to village or state to state. And so it's just as important, quite frankly, as the species of agaves out there. You might have a couple of araqueños that taste dramatically different than each other because, quite frankly, they're produced in different fields with many different processes, both on the way they roast the agave, how much char was put on it, like how long they chose to rest it, and what sort of yeasts came into that open fermentation pit that begins to ferment the tapache and to create this agave beer. Now, this is essentially a cousin of pulque that we had talked about before, and this has been around for a long time. But the Spaniards brought in the distillation process in alembic stills. Now, most stills these days in mezcal production, they've moved on to a lot of copper stills, but there are a number of products out there that are still made in old school clay stills, which are pretty cool and pretty unique. Looking at a few of these, Over here, I've got a Mezcal Vago, Ensamble en Barro. And if you see that word en barro, that means that this particular Mezcal happens to be distilled in a clay still in a very old school, rustic manner. And it's going to add a lot of earthiness and minerality to the Mezcal, almost like a wet cement after a warm summer rain type flavor on the back end of the palate to your Mezcal. So look out for these ones. They're a lot rare, and they tend to be a little more expensive as well too, because quite frankly, the yield is less, and it's a less than efficient old school manner of how to produce Mezcal. But something that's distilled in barro is a really, really unique flavor characteristic to Mezcal, and something you're not gonna find in your everyday tequila. So this particular Mezcal, or excuse me, this tepache goes into the still along with a mix of the bagazo as well too. And we heat that product up, and the alcohol begins to evaporate first out through the top and goes through copper cooling tubes or some semblance of cooling tube, perhaps even water cooling some sort of metal tube, and it drips out the other side, becoming ordinario. After one distillation, it's approximately 20% alcohol by volume. And if you remember, we left the heads and the tails out of the distillation. What does that mean? The first little bit that comes out and the last little bit that come out have a lot of ethers and esters, and particularly on the tails end, fusel oils. And fusel oils in German means bad liquor. And so there's a reason you kind of want to get that stuff the heck out of there, if you know what I'm saying. How much they leave out or in is the part of the artisanal process as well too, adding to the variation in Mezcal production. But we leave the heads and tails out, and then we put that batch back in the still a second time and we distill it. And what drips out the other side is now Mezcal Joven. Now there are multiple categories of Mezcal, and they tend to use very similar nomenclature to tequila, but not 100% the same. There's one trick I want you guys to look out for out there, and that's the use of the word joven. There are three categories right now of Mezcal that are recognized by the CRM, and that's joven, reposado, and añejo. The joven is the unaged to 2 months. It literally would be the exact same characteristics that Blanco tequila uses. However, tequila uses the word joven in a different context. And so I want you to be careful with this, because joven in tequila form generally means a mixto. And if you remember the mixtos, that was a tequila that was only 51% agave juice. The other 40 up to 49% could be cane sugar. It generally means bad tequila. Joven is kind of something to walk away from in the tequila world. But in the Mezcal world, joven would just literally translate to your Blanco, essentially. It's the unaged to 2 months aging. Reposado Mezcal is aged between 2 months and 1 year, and añejo tequila 1 year and beyond. At this moment, the CRM is not recognizing extra añejo categories for that 3-year aging and beyond like tequila. It may be coming at some point, but the truth is most Mezcal aficionados are gonna go for the joven Mezcals. I have found nearly 100 brands out there that are available for purchase in the state of Arizona right now of Mezcals, and only a very small percentage of them, about a quarter, even offer reposado or añejoed products. And that's because your Mezcal aficionado wants to taste that terroir. They want to taste those regional flavor characteristical differences between that and tequila. And oak, while adding desirable flavor characteristics to your Mezcal, is going to add a vanilla and caramel undertones to it that, while tasty, take away from some of that terroir. And so you're going to find a lot less aging on Mezcal. That being said, if your first introductions to Mezcal, if you've never had it before, it might be useful for you to try it in a reposado or añejo format, because you're going to find more similarities in your palate to liquor that you're accustomed to trying as well too. And so oftentimes I'll take something along the lines of an añejo or reposado tequila and mezcal, and give that to first time mezcal customers so that it isn't so foreign and so out there as some of these species of agave can be. And so while it's not super common, it is out there. So I recommend maybe for the first timers to try something on the Reposado and Añejo and then work your way into the wild and very different flavor characteristics that Joven mezcals can offer you. There's a number of tequila products out there that are probably over 1,000 SKUs that we can get in Arizona, and only about 100 mezcals, giving you an idea of the depth and breadth of the tequila market as opposed to the mezcal market. There's just, quite frankly, an awful lot more out there. Now, the CRM essentially says that mezcal needs to be double distilled, and it needs to be between 36 and 55% alcohol by volume, right? And so the alcohol by volume is often tested on a concept called perlas. And what they do is they actually shake up the bottles of mezcal, and you can see the bubbles forming on the top after this shake up, and they should last about 10 seconds, these bubbles called the perlas. Perlas will exist in mezcal between about 45 and 55% alcohol by volume. And they actually, before there was fancy machines to test alcohol by volume, the perla test was used for years and years by master distillers to determine, to within about 1% accuracy, the alcohol by volume of a mezcal. And so that's an interesting little fact that in a partially open bottle, you could pick it up and shake it and quite frankly see these particular perlas forming as a test for alcohol by volume. It needs to be at least double distilled. It needs to be grown in those 8 particular states as part of the CRM. Now, can mezcal be triple distilled? The answer is yes. There are a few triple distilled tequilas on the market, but not many, because the more times you distill it, the more it starts to take away flavor characteristics. It becomes eventually a grain alcohol. If you distill it a 4th, a 5th, a 6th time, you've just stripped away everything agave or earthiness from that product. But there is a unique triple distilled product out there that's not for the faint of heart, but one of my favorite characteristics of mezcal, one of I think the neatest categories, and that's called a pechuga. Now, pechuga in Spanish means breast, like a breast of chicken, a pechuga de pollo. And how pechugas are made vary from palenque to palenque. And in fact, commercial pechugas have only been on the market in the United States over the last decade. And this is a triple distillation of mezcal, but a very unique triple distillation. Why would the word for breast be in there? Well, because this was the distiller's cut. This was the part that the distillers used to essentially keep for themselves and was not sold on the market. But this triple distillate, they would add local fruits and nuts into the still. After this mezcal came out of the still a second time, they would put it back in the still and add these local plants, fruits, and herbs and spices. And then on top of it, they would string up a big turkey inside of that still, a guajolote, right? Like a wild turkey. And that during the 3rd distillation, the steam would rise up from this 3rd distillation and cook that wild turkey inside of the still. And the fats and juices would drip out into the distillate and steam up into the pipes and drip out the other side as well too. And that 3rd wild flavor characteristic that comes out of this 3rd distillate is called a pechuga. And it's a very, very rare and quite frankly, very expensive expression of mezcal with very unique local flavors, not just because of the terroir, but because of what they cooked on the inside of this. There are pechugas out there that they make with turkeys. They make it with chicken. I've seen, there's one, Del Maguey has one with a giant Spanish ham in there called the Iberico as well too. So a number of different animal products are cooked. And essentially the distiller gets not only a very unique mezcal, but a delicious dinner at the end of that particular cycle, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. And so pechugas are a very rare and very interesting expression of mezcal that I think are really neat and something you guys should look out for as well too, quite frankly. And so essentially there are 50 different species of agaves, each of which has its own unique flavor characteristics. The most common you're going to find is espadín. But some of the other more common ones that you're going to see out there include Tobalá, Araqueño, Mexicali, various types of Karwinskis. There are many, and their flavor characteristics run the gauntlet. Some are similar in tequila-like, where your espadín and the Araqueño sort of sit in the middle of the road. There are these others that tend to be far more herbaceous, like tepestate, far more minerality to it. And there are others, like the Tobalá, that have a sweetie, like a fruit-like characteristics to it as well, too, with tropical notes of even banana or plums or mangoes to them. And I find them incredibly interesting. Some of my particular favorite mezcals happen to be up here with us as well right now. We carry proudly at Reforma a line of mezcal called the Mezcal Carreño. Now, the owners of Mezcal Carreño, Ivan and Abel, have been here to Reforma with us to help educate our staff about their mezcal. They grew up in Phoenix, but it was actually their grandfather's distillery that started making mezcal back in 1904. And so they have figured out a way to keep on the family tradition and are an Arizona-based company that produces this Oaxacan mezcal for sale here. And they produce some wonderful expressions of mezcal. They've got a tobaziche, which is a very unique type of agave. They also produce, and I'm gonna see if I can, the tepestate, like what we talked about, and they've got an ensamble as well too. And some of these ensamble, this ensamble siete here, the ensamble is a blend of various mezcals, of various, agave species. And in fact, there are 7 agave species that put together this ensamble. Most of the time on your ensamble products, you're gonna find a base of espadín because it's both the cheapest and most commonly found species of agave. And they're gonna add in lots of these local flavors, but it mellows them out so that they're not so wild and crazy. And so I recommend ensambles. I think it's a very unique way to try some of these other agave flavors without having to commit to necessarily full bottles of them, or even finding such odd esoteric products out there as well too. Now, the exact ingredients are often listed on an ensamble, and I think we've got one here for Mezcal Vago, another favorite of mine. Very small batch mezcal here, Vago. Even the labels happen to be made from recycled agave pulp. Like, take a look at that rustic particular label on this Ensamble de Barro over here. And this guy is as small batch as can be. And so they make an amazing ensamble, and they make a really unique product that I recommend some of you guys take a look for. And I don't have the bottle up front over here, but it's called the elote. Elote means corn in Spanish. And in between their agave espadín plants, they plant rows of corn. And during the second distillation, they actually add in some corn, roasted corn, into the stills. Now, that doesn't give you a popcorn-like taste. It almost gives you like a nuttiness to it as well too, that I think is a really, really unique flavor characteristic, but a really great espadín mezcal out there as well too. And so you're going to find just a wide variation of flavors of mezcal out there in the world. And you're going to find a great example of these here at Reforma. And so we'd really love to have you guys come down and give us a try sometime to taste some of these things. We sell them by the ounce. We've got an amazing list of over 300 different types of mezcal, bacanora, sotol, and various distilled agave spirits available here in Reforma. And so hopefully you guys have found this very interesting. One more quick take for you guys. Mezcal is generally in Oaxaca served in a tiny hollowed out gourd called a jicara. And these gourds, I tried to bring them in to the United States and use them for serving mezcal here, but it turns out that the health department has these rules against using recycled gourds and the sanitization rules. And so we can't quite do that. But one of the neat things that we can do with mezcal is serve it in a proper manner. Tequila is served with lime and salt, right? And that's the sort of stereotypical response that you get from tequila. But quite frankly, mezcal is not. Mezcal is served with oranges, right? Normally a sour Seville orange. Here I happen to only have navel oranges available at the moment, but it's not served with lime and salt. You get an orange and you get sal de gusano. What is sal de gusano, you might ask? This is worm salt, right? The basic ingredients in sal de gusano are going to be sea salt, crushed costeño chilies, and the dried crushed bodies of the red maguey worm. And these worms grow on the agave plants as essentially a parasite. But in Mexico, if prepared properly, they're actually considered a delicacy. Tacos de gusano in southern Mexico are very common. Now, we couldn't quite bring tacos de gusano up here to Reforma, as I really didn't think it was going to go so well as a lunch special. But what we do have is sal de gusano, authentic Mexican worm salt. And so what you do with the mezcal is you pour yourself a little taste of the mezcal. I don't have a jicaro over here, so we're going to have to use a glass. And you take the worm salt and you sprinkle it on top of the orange. The idea being that you get some of the sweetness and savoriness of the orange and the worm salt mixing together, right? You're going to get that earthy flavor of worm, the saltiness, the spiciness from the costeño chili, and a bit of sweetness from the orange. And you take the product this way with that taste and then sip the mezcal. It sounds kind of out there, I understand. But God honest, it's delicious. It's like a flavor explosion in your mouth. And so this is something that I'd like you guys to come down here and try. And if you don't, give this an opportunity to try this somewhere else. Experience something new in your life and step out and do something different. A little worm salt goes a long way. I know it sounds weird, but trust me, it's delicious. It's available here at Reforma as well too. So hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about mezcal today. I appreciate your time. I know that everyone's been sitting at home and stressed out quite a bit during this COVID-19 crisis. Just know that we're thinking about you here at Reforma. We love you guys. We can't wait to get back open up and see ya. Come visit us and order some food at plazadining.com. Come by and say hi. Pick yourself up a little mezcal with worm salt. We look forward to serving you again in the future. And thank you very much. Have a great day.